Hey guys, tonight we're wandering the sun-baked streets of ancient Thebes, the Nile. This morning breeze still clinging to your tunic as you approach a bakery already alive with the clatter of wooden paddles and the soft hum of voices. Imagine flour on the air, the scent of yeast and barley rising above the mud-brick rooftops. You're not just here for a loaf, you're here because something has caught your eye. There, behind the bakery gates, is a cluster of bakers, each donning a tall, almost comically towering hat. Some hats bob as their owners knead dough or stoke fires. One leans sideways, threatening to topple into a mixing bowl. You pause, blinking, wondering if it's a mirage. Is everyone in ancient Egypt this stylishly vertical, or have you stumbled into a bread-based secret society? You probably won't survive the morning shift here. Between the heat, the noise, and the sheer athleticism required to keep your hat upright, it's a miracle the bakers do. But as you linger by the entrance, the magic of ancient bread-making draws you in. A donkey brays, a cat slinks under a table, and a child giggles as she tries to balance a flour sack on her head. Clearly, the hat is an aspiration for all ages. Even the local ibis watches, head cocked as if to ask, are you going to try one on or just gawk? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far our sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the bakery's gates, the packed earth cool beneath your sandals, and immediately it's clear. This is a place where hats matter. Not just any hats, of course. These are tall, tapering, and sometimes astonishingly wobbly. The shortest among them barely clears a hand's width, but the tallest seem to defy gravity, swaying like reeds in the Nile wind. One baker, elbows deep in spongy dough, catches your stare and grins, his hat decorated with a single faded blue bead. He gives you a conspiratorial wink, as if to say, yes, they're ridiculous, but we wouldn't bake without them. Mainstream historians agree that bread was the backbone of everyday life in Egypt, so essential, in fact, that workers on the pyramids were often paid partly in loaves and beer. But what rarely gets mentioned is the fashion show happening in every ancient bakery. Hats, it turns out, are more than a quirky accessory. They're a statement. Some say the taller the hat, the greater the baker's skill or ego. Others whisper that hats are just a clever way to keep flour out of your hair and sweat off your face, a low-tech version of a chef's toque. But here is the kicker. No one is really sure when or why the tall hat tradition started. Historians still argue whether the hats originated as practical gear or as a status symbol, or perhaps as a joke that got very, very out of hand. You sidestep a delivery boy carrying a basket of dates, nearly taking out a stack of flatbreads in your haste. Everywhere you look, there is evidence of the hat as rain. Chalky outlines on the wall where someone leaned too close. A hat stand ingeniously fashioned from a broken oar. Even a mural where a Baker S hat is so tall it has been painted curling under the ceiling. But the real show is at the oven. The chief baker, the one with the hat that seems to brush the clouds, commands the room with a flick of his paddle. He's the maestro of yeast, the sultan of sourdough. And that hat, it's not just tall, it's legendary. Some say it once belonged to his grandfather. Others claim it's been reinforced with reeds and a pinch of superstition. One apprentice leans in and whispers to you, careful. If the chief's hat ever falls, we all have to kneel and recite the bread recipe backwards. Beside you, a flour-dusted calendar hangs on the wall, marked with the days of festivals and royal visits. Each event comes with notes about hat height and style, as if these details are as important as the bread itself. And maybe they are. After all, in a world where everyone eats bread, you need something to stand out. Literally. You settle into a quiet corner, watching the parade of hats and the ballet of bakers at work, and you realize, tonight, you're not just learning about bread, but about the curious human need to make even the simplest things, like keeping your hair clean, into a ritual, a competition, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of magic. The first rays of sunlight have barely touched the river, yet the bakery is already alive, ancient Egypt's version of the morning rush. You yawn and rub your eyes, feeling the soft, chalky grit of flour already settling on your skin. The Nile's mist hangs low, weaving between mud brick houses and drifting lazily past the bakery windows. The air is thick with anticipation and a touch of humidity, the kind that promises a sweltering afternoon and a sticky, flour-caked face by midday. You trudge over to the bakery's courtyard, where a few bakers are finishing their dawn rituals. One young apprentice kneels beside a low basin, splashing his face with water from a clay jar. Another carefully dusts off his sandals, making sure not to leave floury footprints on the manager's freshly swept path. A small rebellion, given how quickly the ground will be white again. Over by the ovens, the older bakers perform a more solemn act, lining up their tall hats on a wooden bench, each one straightening the next in a silent, sleepy assembly line. You watch as a grizzled baker, his hat already tilting precariously, gives a slow nod to the Nile, murmuring a prayer for strong yeast and gentle winds. Mainstream historians note that the Nile's flooding was central to Egyptian daily life, dictating everything from agriculture to spirituality. But here's something you won. To find in the textbooks, bakers often claimed that the river's morning mist made the dough rise better, and that the hats, tall as they were, helped catch the blessings drifting in from the water. Some swore by this theory, while others just liked the excuse to step outside and show off their hat before the real work began. Historians still argue whether these rituals were based on genuine belief or were simply a clever way for bakers to stretch their legs and hats before a long shift. As the sun climbs, you see the hats come alive with personality. Some are stiff and new, starched to an improbable degree, while others are patched and faded, sporting the scars of 100 baking mishaps. One baker, always the joker, has snuck a tiny reed boat into the fold of his hat, a silent nod to the Nile's omnipresence. He grins at you, waggling his eyebrows as if to say, "Who says bakers can't be sailors too?" You notice a curious tradition. Before donning their hats, each baker takes a moment to brush the brim with a soft, damp cloth. The rumor is that this not only keeps flour from caking on the rim, but also wards off bad luck. Some say the cloth has to be Nile water. Others insist it must be from the bakery's own well. It is the kind of detail that makes you realize just how much ritual seeps into daily life here. Flour, water, yeast, and a healthy dose of superstition. Suddenly, there's commotion near the storeroom. An apprentice has dropped a sack of emmer wheat, sending a cloud of grain into the morning air. The chief baker sighs, a sound both mournful and resigned, then adjusts his towering hat with a single practiced motion. You sense that the hat isn't just a symbol of rank, but also a kind of armor against daily chaos. In a place where ovens can scorch, dough can flop, and apprentices can trip over their own feet, a tall hat is a small island of control. You edge closer to the ovens, where the real magic happens. The heat is fierce, even this early, and you can almost taste the bread-to-be in the back of your throat. A baker flips a loaf with the skill of a juggler, his hat bobbing in time with every movement. Another, less lucky, has to chase down a runaway roll, his hat flapping like a banner as he sprints. The hat seems to give every action a little extra drama, like a silent film with a very tall costume budget. A fringe theory among Egyptologists suggests these tall hats might have had a practical purpose, trapping the baker's own scent so that the bread didn't absorb too much human essence. It's a bit out there, but then again, ancient Egypt is full of odd solutions to everyday problems. Historians continue to debate whether this idea holds water or if it's just another tall tale, pun absolutely intended. As you linger by the window, you notice something else, the way the hats cast long, wavy shadows on the bakery's walls. In the growing light, these shadows dance and flicker, giving the impression of a crowd much larger than the handful of bakers inside. It's strangely mesmerizing, a gentle, accidental puppet show that marks the start of another day in a city that never really sleeps. A little girl enters carrying a basket of dates. She looks up at the bakers, her eyes wide, and tries to balance a scrap of linen on her own head. The bakers cheer, one offering a mock bow so deep his hat nearly kisses the floor. You can't help but smile. In this place, hats aren't just for show. They're a thread woven through the fabric of daily life, connecting generations and fueling 1,000 inside jokes. And as the Nile's mist fades, leaving only the promise of heat and the scent of rising dough, you realize you've stumbled into a world where even the most practical things, like a baker's hat, are tinged with magic mischief and a gentle sense of community. You barely have time to settle yourself before the first batch of bread emerges from the oven, golden, puffed and crackling with warmth. The aroma is as thick as the morning sun, wrapping around you, pulling you closer to the heart of the bakery. Here, in this flower-filled haven, breakfast is both a science and a celebration. You watch as a baker, hat slightly askew, slides an armful of loaves onto a reed mat. The bread is not just food, it's currency, it's comfort, it's the backbone of Egypt's daily life. Mainstream historians will tell you that bread and beer made up the majority of an ancient Egyptian-esque diet. Wheat and barley were the staples, but bread wasn't always the fluffy stuff you're picturing. Sometimes it was dense and chewy, other times so packed with chaff you'd swear you were eating a sandcastle. But what truly makes breakfast here unique is the wild assortment of grains and add-ins: spelt, emmer, honey, dates, and even the occasional wild onion for those who like a little zing with their carbs. You're handed a chunk of bread, still warm, and a mug of thick, slightly sour beer, the breakfast of champions, or at least the breakfast of people with very sturdy stomachs. The bakers gather in a semicircle, hats bobbing as they eat, swapping stories and playfully arguing about whose loaf is the lightest, whose crust is the crispiest. One baker boasts that his bread rose so high last week it nearly knocked his hat off. Another retorts that she once baked a loaf so dense it doubled as a doorstop for the temple priest. A quirky detail you might not expect. Some bakers swear by adding a pinch of desert sand to their dough, insisting it gives the bread a unique crunch and supposedly builds character. This naturally is hotly debated in the bakery. One man claims it's tradition, another insists it's just laziness. Historians still argue whether these gritty loaves were a matter of necessity, accident, or a test of dental fortitude. You take a tentative bite and hope your modern dentist never hears about this. As the bakers eat, you notice a small shrine tucked into a corner, a painted figurine of Taweret, the hippo goddess of protection. Someone has left an offering, a miniature loaf, carefully shaped and crowned with a doll-sized hat. The bakers take turns tapping the hat for luck before starting their shift, a ritual that's equal parts reverence and friendly competition. Whoever taps last has to sweep the floor, a rule that keeps everyone on their toes and their hats upright. Breakfast is a social affair, full of laughter, gentle ribbing, and the occasional flour fight. You see the chief baker pause to refill his mug, lifting his tall hat just enough to wipe his brow. He grins at you and says, "If your hat's not taller than your loaf, you're not trying hard enough." It's a saying that gets passed around the table, each baker putting their own spin on it, some aiming for the sky with their hats, others content with a sturdy, sensible brim. There's a quiet moment as everyone chews, the only sound the crunch of crust and the distant call of a heron by the river. Someone breaks the silence by suggesting a breakfast challenge. Whose hat can balance a fresh loaf the longest? You're volunteered, of course, and soon you find yourself with a warm, slightly wobbly roll perched atop your borrowed hat. The bakers cheer, offering tips. Lean back. Don't breathe. Pretend you're a statue of Osiris until the loaf tumbles off and lands, miraculously, in the arms of a passing cat. Amid the laughter, you notice one baker quietly setting aside his crusts, explaining that he'll feed them to the ibis that visit later. They like the crunchy bits, he says, as if this is common knowledge. The others nod solemnly, and one even claims that the ibis, in return, blesses the dough by singing to the yeast. Whether there's any truth to this, no one can say. Historians still debate the role of birds in Egyptian bakeries, though the ibis certainly seems to enjoy the perks. Breakfast winds down, and the bakers drift back to their stations, hats straightened, spirits high. You find yourself marveling at how, even in the most ordinary routines, there's room for ritual, rivalry, and a healthy dose of silliness. Here, the day begins not just with bread, but with camaraderie, superstition, and a hat that's always just a little too tall, or depending on who you ask, just tall enough. You linger by the back storeroom, drawn by the muffled shuffling and the soft thump of a hat being set down with great reverence. The storeroom is a shadowy, cool refuge from the swelling heat outside, a place where secrets and perhaps a few stale rolls accumulate. Here, among sacks of barley and bundles of dried dates, sits a simple wooden shelf dedicated entirely to hats. It's the sort of thing you'd expect in a hat shop, not a bakery. But in this world, hats are as essential as yeast. The hats themselves are a marvel, some tall and proud, others so patched and faded you wonder if they're held together by hope alone. There are hats with embroidered bands, hats with the odd bead or amulet sewn into the brim, and one that looks suspiciously like it started life as a fishing net. You reach out, fingers brushing against the rough linen of the tallest hat, a hat that seems to radiate its own quiet authority. This, you sense, is the baker's crown, the symbol of someone who's earned the right to knead, shape and command. Historians generally agree that Egyptian bakers wore distinctive hats, but the original purpose is shrouded in as much steam as the first morning batch of bread. Some scholars insist the hats began as a practical solution, keeping sweat, dust, and the occasional wayward lock of hair out of the dough. Others argue the hats were a badge of honor, a way to separate the master bakers from the apprentices. Still others, and this is where things get quirky, believe the hats had a ritual significance, with the height corresponding to the baker's spiritual rise, not unlike the bread itself. Historians still argue whether the hat's origins are rooted in practicality, status, or a blend of both. You watch as the chief baker selects his hat for the day. There's a moment of meditation, almost like a priest choosing the right vestment before a ceremony. He runs his hands gently over the linen, checking for worn seams, and mutters something under his breath, perhaps a blessing or a reminder to keep the apprentice from burning the date rolls again. The hat is tall, but not absurdly so. It's clearly been reinforced with extra stitching, the kind that says, "I expect to wear this through more than one bread festival." A lesser-known fact: some ancient Egyptian hats were reportedly scented with herbs or flowers, a fringe practice among particularly competitive bakeries. The idea was to mask the less than glamorous aromas of sweat and smoke, and maybe, just maybe, to infuse the bread with a hint of lavender or mint. Whether this worked is, of course, debatable. Historians still argue whether such scented hats were genuinely popular or just a passing fad. But you do catch a faint whiff of something sweet as the chief baker places his hat atop his head. And you can't help but wonder what today's loaves will taste like. Suddenly, a small commotion. One apprentice can't find his hat. He searches high and low, rummaging through shelves until finally he pulls out a hat so squashed it looks like a collapsed loaf. The other bakers burst into gentle laughter, and even the chief cracks a smile. "Perhaps today you rise with your bread," he jokes. The apprentice, undeterred, reshapes the hat as best he can and wears it proudly, albeit slightly off-center. You notice hats come in all shapes and states of repair. Some are tall and stiff, others soft and flopping. There's a rumor, almost certainly started by the laziest baker, that the best hats are the ones that can double as a pillow for a midday nap. You try to imagine the chief baker, towering hat askew, snoring in the corner while the dough proves beside him. Stranger things have happened. One hat, sitting apart from the rest, catches your attention. It's decorated with tiny clay beads and a single feather. An older baker tells you it belonged to a woman who once baked the pharaoh's favorite honey cakes. She was rumored to have started the tall hat trend after a particularly competitive festival when her hat was mistaken for a ceremonial headdress. Whether this charming origin story is true or just another bakery legend, historians still argue. But the feather remains, a tiny, persistent rebellion against the ordinary. The storeroom grows quieter as each baker claims their headgear and files out, leaving you with a sense of awe at the ritualistic care given to what most would consider an accessory. Here, the hat is more than a cover for stray hairs or a badge of office. It's a symbol, a story, a quiet rebellion against the sameness of daily toil. You follow the procession out, sunlight illuminating the dust motes in the air, and realize that in this bakery, the hat's origins may be debated, but its presence is never questioned. Each one is unique, each one a silent testament to the dreams, mishaps, and ambitions of the bakers who dare to wear them. The morning sun creeps higher as you drift toward the heart of the bakery, watching the day's pecking order shuffle into place. It's an unspoken ritual. Hats go on, and suddenly every baker knows exactly where they stand. The tallest hats move with quiet authority, gliding past the ovens like high priests of flour and yeast. The shorter hats, the apprentices and helpers, buzz around the edges, darting between tables, fetching baskets, and occasionally sneaking glances at the headgear hierarchy in action. It's a spectacle of status, as clear as the difference between a fresh-baked aish baladi and a day-old crust. The chief baker's hat is always the tallest by a good hand's width, stitched with a blue stripe only the most experienced can earn. The second in command sports a slightly shorter hat, its brim decorated with a faded gold thread. The apprentices, meanwhile, wear hats that can only be described as aspirational, floppy, slightly lopsided, and often bearing the smudge of a failed dough experiment. You can help but notice the way the youngest apprentice eyes the chief's towering hat with a mix of awe and ambition, as if by sheer willpower his own cap might stretch an extra inch. The other bakers notice too, and one leans over to whisper, "He's got rising ambitions, that one." You stifle a laugh, realizing bakery humor is alive and well. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that Egyptian society was deeply hierarchical, and even the bakery was no exception. Whether in temples, farms, or kitchens, status was marked by subtle details, jewelry, linen quality, or in this case, the upward reach of a baker's hat. But here's a delightful fringe tidbit. Some believe that on festival days, apprentices would stuff their hats with reeds or even scraps of papyrus, hoping to fool visiting inspectors into thinking they'd earned a promotion. Historians still argue whether this was an open secret among the bakers or a clever prank that occasionally backfired, resulting in a lopsided parade of imposters. As you weave through the work tables, you see that hat height isn't the only mark of rank. The chief baker's paddle is polished smooth from years of use, and his work area is always closest to the main oven, a spot reserved for the seasoned hands who can judge a loaf's readiness by scent alone. The apprentices are stationed near the water jars and flour bins, tasked with the endless labor of mixing, measuring, and cleaning up the floury aftermath of each shift. It's not glamorous, but every baker knows you have to earn your stripes and your extra inches. A hush falls as the chief prepares the special Pharaoh's loaf. It's a doughy masterpiece, braided and brushed with honey, destined for the temple's daily offering. All eyes are on the chief, whose hat seems to grow even taller in the morning light. The apprentices watch, holding their breath, each secretly hoping to be chosen as the hat bearer, the one who gets to carry the chief's hat during the more delicate stages of baking. It's a coveted job, and not just because it means a break from kneading dough. Rumor has it that the hat bearer absorbs a little of the chief's luck, a superstition that's never written down but always respected. You catch another quirky detail. Bakers have developed a subtle, almost secret language of hat gestures. A quick tip of the brim means watch the oven, while a sideways tilt can signal fetch more water. It is a system born from necessity. When the ovens roar and the bakery is a cacophony of shouts and clanging pots, words get lost, but hats speak volumes. Historians still debate whether this hat language was unique to bakers or if other trades had their own version. But there's no denying that a well-timed hat tilt can avert disaster, or at least a burnt batch. As the morning wears on, the hierarchy softens. Bakers trade jokes, swap stories about legendary loaves, and occasionally poke fun at the day's most flamboyant headgear. The chief, usually so dignified, cannot resist a sly grin when an apprentice's hat flops forward and lands in a bowl of date paste. "Careful," he says, "or your ambitions will be too sweet to rise." By now, you've come to appreciate the rhythm of the place, the gentle rivalry, the unspoken rules, the way hats mark not just status, but belonging. In this world of flour and fire, a tall hat is both a target and a trophy, a promise that with enough patience and maybe a little luck, even the flattest loaf can someday rise. As you settle into the morning chaos, a new appreciation dawns for the multitasking genius that is the Egyptian baker's hat. You watch a middle-aged woman deftly knead dough with one hand while adjusting her tall linen hat with the other, not missing a beat. The hat doesn't just proclaim rank or offer a dash of sartorial flair. It's also, you realize, a line of defense against the relentless bakery heat and the ever-present threat of sweat dripping into the dough. In this oven-baked world, style must bow to practicality, though neither gives up without a good-natured tussle. The main ovens roar, flames licking up the sides, raising the temperature to melt-your-sandals levels. Every baker is glistening, and you're sweating just watching them. The hats, despite their regal height, are surprisingly lightweight, made of loosely woven linen or reeds, allowing the tiniest whisper of a breeze, if the Nile gods are feeling generous, to reach the scalp. One baker, noticing you fanning yourself with a palm frond, jokes, "If your hat's not making you sweat, you're not working hard enough." Another chimes in, "Or you're just not tall enough yet." The laughter is quick, the camaraderie as warm as the ovens. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancient Egyptian workers, especially those laboring near heat, had various tricks for coping with the climate. Light, breathable fabrics, head coverings and wet cloths were all part of the toolkit. But here in the bakery, the hat is the undisputed MVP, part sweatband, part status symbol. There's even an old saying scrawled on a bit of pottery near the door: "A baker without a hat is a loaf without a crust." It's a phrase passed down like a family recipe, equal parts wisdom and gentle ribbing. Yet, there's another layer to this story, a quirky tidbit that would make even the most serious Egyptologist smile. Some hats are lined with thin reeds, not just for shape, but to absorb sweat before it could drip into the dough. One apprentice confides in you, lowering his voice as if sharing a state secret. "My cousin in Memphis tried stuffing his hat with lotus leaves once. Smelled nice, but the bees wouldn't leave him alone for a week." You imagine the chaos of a bee-chased baker, hat askew, arms flailing, and can't help but grin. Not all hat innovations are successful, though. A famous bakery tale, retold with relish every new moon gathering, involves a baker who, hoping to prove his cleverness, wove his hat from dried fish skin. "It kept the sweat out," he boasted, "but the cats wouldn't let me work in peace." The story always gets a laugh, And you'll be left wondering how many of these tall tales are rooted in truth and how many are just part of the bakery's living folklore. Historians still argue whether these oddball hat experiments were widespread or simply the stuff of apprentice pranks and late-night wagers. You notice too how the hat becomes a canvas for personality. Some bakers tie colored ribbons, often scraps from old tunics, around the base, while others embroider tiny symbols. An ankh here, a barley stalk there, into the brim. The chief baker's hat, for example, boasts a small ivory bead at its peak, rumored to be a good luck charm passed down through generations. It keeps the bread from burning, he claims with a wink, though the apprentices suspect it's more about looking distinguished in the annual bakery portrait. The hats even have their own etiquette. If a baker needs to step away from the dough, she must place her hat on the clean shelf, never the flour bin, a superstition as old as the Nile itself. The idea, so they say, is to keep the hat's spirit from getting too close to the raw ingredients, lest the bread refuse to rise. Whether there's any logic to this, no one can say. Historians still debate whether such rituals had practical roots or simply added a touch of magic to the monotony of daily work. Mid-morning, the bakery is a whir of movement, the hats bobbing and weaving in a flowery ballet. You catch yourself thinking, in a room this hot, with this much sweat and chaos, maybe a tall hat is the only thing keeping anyone sane. It's a point of pride, a badge of survival, and a gentle reminder that even in the stickiest situations, a little style and a lot of sweat can go a long way. You drift over to the workbench, the scent of fresh bread mingling with something earthier, like sun-dried reeds and crisp linen. Here, away from the fire and bustle, you get a closer look at the hats themselves. Each one seems almost alive, shaped and reshaped by countless hands and years of tradition. You run your fingers over the brim of a particularly tall hat, marveling at the way it manages to be both feather-light and surprisingly sturdy. It's a minor engineering wonder, born of necessity and a bit of showmanship. Mainstream historians agree that most ancient Egyptian clothing was made from linen, a fabric woven from flax grown along the Nile's fertile banks. But when it comes to hats, the rules are delightfully flexible. Some hats are pure linen, soft and light, perfect for the hottest days. Others are reinforced with strips of palm or woven reeds, adding height and a touch of rustic flair. You even spot one hat with a lining of what looks like papyrus, its edges curling like the pages of an ancient scroll. Then there's the real oddity, a hat hanging near the window, shimmering faintly in the morning sun. The story goes that it was woven from fish skin. Yes, fish skin, by a baker who lost a bet and had to wear it for a week. The result? A hat that was waterproof, slightly fragrant, and extremely popular with the neighborhood cats. Quirky tales like this abound, though historians still argue whether such materials were ever used in earnest, or if this is just another tall story passed down to amuse apprentices and tourists alike. You watch as a baker repairs a tear with nimble fingers, using a needle carved from bone and thread spun from flax. She hums softly, her hands moving with a calm precision that speaks of years in the trade. There's a quiet pride in the way bakers care for their hats, patching, reinforcing, and sometimes embellishing with scraps of colored cloth or even tiny amulets. One old-timer claims that the more patches your hat has, the more lucky chances you've survived. Every rip is a story, he says, pointing to a row of stitches near his hat's base. And every patch is a promise that you'll be back tomorrow. It's not just about durability, though. There's a subtle artistry at play, a desire to stand out in a world where life can be repetitive and routines unyielding. Some bakers add beadwork or paint simple designs along the rim. You see one hat decorated with a row of tiny clay loaves, each one representing a festival won or a new bread recipe mastered. The chief baker's hat, naturally, is the most elaborate, with a band of blue-dyed linen and a single carefully carved lapis bead at the peak. That bead keeps the mice away, he jokes, though the real secret might just be keeping the bread locked away at night. You can't help but wonder at the ingenuity and creativity poured into these hats. They're not just practical, they're deeply personal. Each one tells a story of victories, defeats, and the thousand small moments that make up a baker's life. There's something comforting about this, a reminder that even in a world ruled by pharaohs and gods, ordinary people still find ways to leave their mark. A fringe theory you overhear from an apprentice. Some hats, he whispers, were rumoured to be enchanted. My uncle swears his hat made the dough rise faster, he insists, eyes wide with the conviction of youth, but only if he wore it backwards. The older bakers roll their eyes, but you sense a flicker of belief, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there's a little magic left in the weave. Historians still debate whether these tales of enchanted hats are rooted in real belief or are simply a way to lighten long hours and heavy workloads. Either way, you find yourself rooting for the magic. After all, in a world full of sweat and flour, who couldn't use a little enchantment now and then? As you sit, surrounded by these marvels of material and memory, you realize the hats are more than just accessories. They're shields, trophies, canvases, and sometimes the last word in a friendly rivalry. In the ancient Egyptian bakery, a tall hat is a badge of honor, a work of art, and a tiny rebellion against the sameness of each sun-baked day. You barely have time to savor the quiet artistry of the hats before chaos erupts. An apprentice sneezes, sending a cloud of flour billowing through the air and straight onto the chief baker's freshly starched hat. Laughter ricochets off the mud brick walls. Even the usually stoic chief can't suppress a grin as he dusts himself off, a pale ghost of his former, dignified self. The hats, for all their symbolic weight and whispered secrets, are not immune to the daily slapstick routine of bakery life. You watch as another apprentice, in a rush to fetch water, slips on a patch of spilled grain. His hat, already a little worse for wear, sails across the room and lands with comedic precision atop the cat's favorite sleeping spot. The cat doesn't even flinch, just blinks slowly, as if hats are an everyday hazard. The bakery erupts in gentle ribbing. Careful, the cat's next in line for chief baker, someone shouts, and the room dissolves into giggles. Mainstream historical fact. The work of ancient Egyptian bakers was physically demanding and unrelenting, long hours, heavy loads, and a constant battle against dust, heat, and the ever-present risk of mistakes. But what the records rarely mention is how humor greased the wheels of daily life. From hat-related pranks to impromptu song contests and flour battles, the bakehouse was a stage for light-hearted rebellion. These moments of levity were as essential as the bread itself. A quirky tidbit: some apprentices, desperate for a bit of shade, would sneak scraps of cloth or even palm leaves into their hats, only to have them fall out at the worst moments. There's a legendary story about a festival parade where an apprentice's hat, overloaded with decorations, collapsed mid-march, showering the procession with beads, feathers, and a single slightly bruised fig. Historians still argue whether this incident inspired a temporary ban on excessive hat flair, or if it's just another tall tale passed down to warn apprentices about the dangers of overreaching, literally. You notice that dress codes are not so much enforced as negotiated, day by day, loaf by loaf. The chief baker will shake his head at the most outlandish hats, issuing mock-serious warnings about losing one's dignity. Yet he can't quite hide his amusement when an apprentice appears with a hat so wide it knocks over the bread paddle every time he turns. The line between tradition and parody is thin, and everyone seems to walk it with the same wobbly grace as a hat perched just a little too high. Some hats bear the scars of past disasters, a burn mark here, a flour stain there, or a patch clearly sown in the midst of a particularly hectic morning. One baker proudly displays a hat with a crooked brim, claiming it was blessed by the goddess of chaos herself. Whether that blessing helps or hinders his baking is, as always, a matter of debate. Historians still argue whether such lucky hats were cherished keepsakes or just too much trouble to replace. You're invited to join in the fun. An apprentice hands you a flour-dusted hat, daring you to walk the length of the bakery without losing it. The hat feels oddly top-heavy, and after a few tentative steps, you find yourself teetering, arms outstretched like a stork. The bakers cheer you on, offering unhelpful advice. Walk as if you've got a pyramid on your head. And when the hat inevitably slips, they erupt in applause, as if you've just performed a grand feat. It's all in good fun, the bakery's unofficial initiation for newcomers. A particularly memorable moment. One baker attempts to toss his hat onto a hook across the room, only to miss and send it spinning into a basket of rising dough. "That's tomorrow's special, hat bread," someone crows, and the laughter rolls on. In these moments, you see the hats for what they truly are. Not just symbols of skill or status, but badges of camaraderie, humility, and shared mischief. They're the punchline to 100 inside jokes, the silent witnesses to every blunder and triumph. No matter how tall the hat, it's the laughter beneath it that keeps the bakery's spirit rising, day after dusty, delicious day. As the laughter dies down, the scent of honey and freshly baked loaves beckons you closer to the ovens. It's time for one of the day's most anticipated rituals, preparing the pharaoh's favorite loaf. The chief baker, with his hat standing tall and proud, if a little flour dusted from recent hijinks, takes center stage. Today's recipe is a carefully guarded secret, whispered from master to apprentice over generations. The excitement in the air is palpable. Even the youngest helpers stand a little straighter, their hats brushed and brims smoothed with nervous anticipation. Mainstream historians agree that bread was more than just a staple in ancient Egypt. It was a symbol of prosperity, a sacred offering, and for the lucky few, a connection to the divine. Pharaohs and high priests received the finest loaves, sometimes laced with honey, dates, and exotic spices. The pharaoh's loaf, as it's affectionately called, is a marvel of culinary pride and precision, braided and glazed until it gleams like the Nile at sunrise. But here's the quirky twist. Whenever a royal visit or temple festival approached, the baker's hat seemed to reach new heights. Literally. Some say it was about impressing the royal inspectors. Others believe it was a form of gentle rebellion, a contest to see who could create the most outlandish silhouette. A few bold souls even attached tiny lotus flowers or gold-painted reeds to their hats, risking the chief's sternest glare for a fleeting moment of fame. Historians still argue whether these hat-raising traditions were acts of devotion, sly humor, or simply a way to outshine the bakery next door. You watch the chief as he rolls out the dough, his tall hat casting a dignified shadow over the workbench. He hums an old tune, one that apparently encourages the yeast to rise, at least according to local superstition. The apprentices form a respectful circle, ready to assist at a moment's notice. The chief gestures for the honey jar, and a helper sprints over, nearly tripping on his own hat. The room holds its breath as the chief drizzles golden honey in an intricate spiral, a flourish that elicits a round of appreciative murmurs. A lesser-known detail: the pharaoh's loaf is never eaten by the bakers themselves. Instead, it's whisked away by temple officials, destined for the altar or the royal table. The closest the bakers get is the test loaf, a smaller version baked alongside the original, used to check for taste and texture. This practice, both practical and a little bit cruel, is the source of endless jokes. Imagine baking a feast and only tasting the crumbs, one baker laments, to which another replies, "That's why our hats are so tall, so we can smell the bread better." You notice the mood in the bakery shift from playful to reverent. The chief's movements grow more deliberate, and even the apprentices hush their laughter. There's a sense of performing for unseen gods and rulers, of participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. The hats, once objects of humor, now seem almost ceremonial, crowns for a fleeting moment as the bakery transforms into a sacred space. And yet even in this solemn moment, individuality peeks through. One apprentice's hat sports a lopsided lotus tucked behind the brim, a silent rebellion against the day's formality. Another baker's hat is patched with a strip of blue linen, a nod to the Nile's blessing. Historians still debate whether these small acts of personal flair were tolerated or quietly punished, but the bakers themselves seem content to let their hats tell their stories, blending tradition with a dash of mischief. As the pharaoh's loaf is carefully lifted from the oven, golden, fragrant, and almost too beautiful to eat, the chief removes his hat with a graceful bow. The room erupts in gentle applause, the hats bobbing in unison. For a moment, you feel the heartbeat of the past, steady and warm, echoing in the simple act of baking bread and wearing a hat just a little taller than necessary. You wander toward the quieter side of the bakery, where the air is filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the softer, sweeter scent of honey cakes cooling on woven mats. Here, you find a circle of women, their hands deft as they shape dough and roll it into intricate knots and braids. Their hats, though just as tall as the men's, are often decorated with delicate touches, embroidered bands, tiny beads, or a single flower tucked behind the ear. It's a gentle rebellion against the sameness of white linen, and it adds a quiet, artistic flair to the room. Mainstream historians sometimes overlook the role of women in ancient Egyptian bakeries, but you see firsthand that they're every bit as skillful, quick-witted and competitive as their male counterparts. In some bakeries, women dominate the morning shift, their laughter rising above the clatter of mixing bowls and the distant roar of the ovens. They swap stories, offer advice, and, true to form, gently tease each other about hat height and crooked brims. One woman, older and clearly respected, wears a hat so tall it nearly grazes the ceiling's reed beams. She catches your stare and smiles, explaining that her hat was a gift from her daughter, made for the festival of Opet, when the city, bread, was judged by priests and commoners alike. The hat is ringed with blue thread and a single bronze button, a badge of honor for the best honey cake in Thebes. She claims with a wink that the hat brings her luck and keeps the flour out of her hair. The other women roll their eyes, but you sense the pride in their banter. A quirky tradition emerges as you watch. Each year, the women compete to invent a new bread shape, and the winning design is immortalized on a tiny patch sewn onto the creator's hat. This year's winner is a spiral twist inspired by the Nile's eddies. The patch, a careful swirl of colored thread, stands out against the linen, a tiny badge of innovation in a world that values tradition. Historians still debate whether these competitions were common or unique to certain regions, but the rivalry is real and the bragging rights enormous. You're offered a taste of a legendary recipe, one whispered about by apprentices and coveted by every would-be baker in Thebes. It's a honey cake, soft and golden, with an aftertaste of wild herbs and something almost floral. The recipe, they say, was handed down from a woman who once baked for the queen herself. The secret: patience, a cool oven, and a hat tall enough to impress the gods. The women joke. No one will say more, but the knowing twinkle in their eyes tells you all you need to know. The recipe is a closely guarded treasure, hidden in the folds of flour-dusted hats and family stories. You notice the camaraderie and gentle competition that define this side of the bakery. There are jokes about whose hat is the straightest, whose dough is the springiest, and even a rumor that the tallest hat once got stuck in the bakery's doorway during a festival rush. The laughter is infectious, the mood light and confident. The women work quickly, but never at the expense of style or a well-placed barb. It's a reminder that, in the bakehouse, mastery is measured not just in loaves, but in laughter, pride, and a hat worn a little taller than yesterday. Historians still argue whether these legendary recipes were ever written down, or if they lived only in the memories and hands of skilled bakers. In this room, though, you see living proof that tradition endures, stitched into hats, shared in stories, and tasted in every crumb of honey cake passed around the circle. You leave the women's corner with a smile, a lingering sweetness on your tongue, and a sense of wonder at the quiet ways bakers, especially women, have shaped the history of bread and the tall hats that go with it. You step back into the main room and find the morning sun now streaming through high, narrow windows, painting golden stripes across the flour-dusted floor. The bakery hums with a rhythm all its own, loaves rising, ovens crackling, laughter and chatter winding between the workbenches. It's nearly time for the midday break, but the hats show no sign of flagging. If anything, they seem to stand even taller in the heat, as if defying the weight of the day. A group of apprentices, emboldened by the relative calm, gather near the door for the daily ritual of the Great Hat Swap. It is a game as old as the bakery itself. Everyone tosses their hats in a pile, then scrambles to grab a new one at random. There are shrieks of laughter as a burly apprentice ends up with a tiny, flower-bedecked hat, while the smallest baker is dwarfed by a towering, reed-supported chef's crown. The chief watches from afar, pretending disapproval, but there's a twinkle in his eye. "Remember," he calls, "the bread rises better when the baker's head is confused." Mainstream historians often focus on the seriousness of ancient Egyptian labor, but here you see the daily mischief and joy that balance out the hard work. The hat swap is more than a bit of fun. It's a reminder that status, while important, is never set in stone. For a few minutes, the apprentice becomes chief, the chief becomes apprentice, and everyone bows, sometimes literally, to avoid knocking over a basket of rolls, to the absurdity of fate. A quirky detail. It's considered very bad luck to drop a hat during the game. If a hat hits the floor, you're tasked with cleaning the flour bins for a week, a fate worse than burnt crusts, if the groans are any indication. There's also a rule, strictly enforced by the oldest baker, that no one can wear the same hat twice in a row during the Great Hat Swap Week. Legends say this tradition originated after a particularly competitive festival, when two rival bakeries tried to outdo each other with the tallest hats in Thebes. The resulting confusion led to a week of swapped headgear and, surprisingly, some of the fluffiest loaves ever baked. Historians still argue whether the hat swap had any mystical effect on the bread, but the story lives on, retold with ever more dramatic flourishes. After the laughter dies down, the bakers return to their stations, new hats perched precariously on heads. The afternoon light casts long shadows, and you notice again how the hats create a kind of landscape, peaks and valleys, each one a testament to the individual beneath. There's something comforting in the sameness and the difference. Every hat is unique, every baker part of a lineage stretching back through generations. You're invited to share in the midday meal, a simple feast of bread, salted fish, cheese and sweet beer. The bakers sit in a circle, hats slightly askew from the morning's adventures, and swap stories about legendary loaves and heroic baking blunders. One story, told with great relish, involves a hat so tall it knocked over a sacred oil lamp in the temple kitchen, causing a minor panic and a new rule: no hats in the temple after dark. Another tale recalls the time a mouse made its nest in an apprentice's hat, prompting a new round of embellishments, tiny bells to scare away unwanted guests. Amidst the laughter, you realize that the hats are more than just fabric and reeds. They're vessels for memory, trophies of hard-won skill, and symbols of the playful spirit that keeps the bakery's heart beating. Each hat holds a story, and every wearer adds a new chapter. As you bite into a still warm roll, you find yourself wondering what stories your own hat might someday hold, should you be lucky enough to earn one. The afternoon settles over the bakery like a soft blanket, muffling the earlier chaos to a drowsy hum. The ovens glow and crackle, but the pace has slowed. Most of the morning's bread is cooling on wide reed trays, and the bakers, hats askew from heat and hard work, take a moment to rest. Some lean in doorways, sipping sweet beer or nibbling crusts, trading gossip about which grain shipment is late and whose hat survived the great hat swap most honorably or most comically. You notice a small group gathered around the chief baker, who sits cross-legged near the open window, hat resting on his knees. He jests, telling stories, the kind that only surface when the work is mostly done and the mood is just right. The oldest bakers nod along, while the apprentices, still sticky with sweat and ambition, listen wide-eyed. Mainstream historians agree that storytelling was a cherished tradition in ancient Egypt, from the grandest palaces to the humblest kitchens. But what the records don't capture is how these stories become woven into the very fabric of daily life. How each tale about a runaway loaf, a lucky hat, or a festival disaster adds another thread to the collective memory of the bakery. One story in particular catches your attention: the legend of the strange bread that rose too high. According to the chief, many years ago a baker's hat was so tall it brushed the ceiling beams and tickled a passing god's fancy. That night, the baker's loaves rose so high they pushed the oven door open and rolled down the street, scattering crumbs all the way to the market. The baker was celebrated as a hero, and for weeks afterward, bakers across the city wore their hats as high as they dared, hoping for their own miracle rise. To this day, the festival of the tall loaf is marked by a contest, not just of bread, but of hats, with prizes for the most outlandish creations. Historians still argue whether the story has any basis in fact, but the annual Tall Loaf Parade is a fixture of local life, with even the most serious bakers competing for the coveted golden hat pin. A quirky custom follows the story. After telling a tale about hats, it's tradition to tap your own hat 3 times for luck. The bakers do so in unison, their hats bobbing like reeds in the Nile breeze. You join in, feeling a little silly and a lot included. The chief then invites everyone to share their own hat luck, tiny superstitions and personal rituals. One baker always spins her hat 3 times before putting it on. Another tucks a barley grain inside the brim for good luck. An apprentice sheepishly admits to whispering encouragement to his hat before every festival bake. The group laughs, but no one doubts the power of a well-loved hat and a hopeful heart. Historians still debate whether these rituals actually affect the bread, but in this room belief is enough. As the sun dips lower, long shadows stretch across the floor and the bakery begins to stir again. The evening batch must be started, and preparations for the next day's flour delivery are underway. Hats are straightened, ribbons retied, and the gentle magic of the afternoon recedes into the practical demands of dough and fire. You linger a moment longer, watching as the bakers return to their stations, inspired by the stories and strengthened by the laughter. The hats, so often the butt of jokes and the subject of rivalry, become symbols of belonging. A silent promise that tomorrow you'll all gather again, ready for another round of flowery chaos and tall tales. As you rise to help with the evening bake, you feel the weight of the hat on your own head, real or imagined, a little lighter, a little luckier, and a little more your own. The evening brings a hush to the bakery, the kind that settles gently after a long, bustling day. The ovens, once roaring, now glow with a quieter heat. The air is heavy with the scent of cooling bread and the faint, grassy fragrance of fresh linen hats hung up for the night. Shadows flicker on the walls, cast by the last flames and the slow, deliberate movements of bakers cleaning their stations. You notice the rituals of closing time are just as steeped in tradition as the morning ones. Each baker removes their hat with care, dusting off flour and checking for new stains or stitches that need mending. Some hats are stowed on pegs driven into the walls, others folded neatly and slipped into woven baskets. The chief baker's hat, majestic even after a long day, is placed on a special shelf above the main oven, a place of quiet honor where the next morning's first rays of sun will touch it before any other. Mainstream historians might describe ancient Egyptian workdays as strictly regimented, but here you see the soft edges, the quiet conversations, the small acts of care for tools and clothing, the way hats are handled almost as living companions. There's a sense that each baker's hat carries the weight of the day, absorbing stories, sweat, and the intangible spark of community. A quirky detail. Before leaving, each baker gives their hat a gentle tap or tug, a superstitious gesture meant to shake off any bad luck or lingering mistakes before heading home. It is said that forgetting this custom guarantees a flat loaf or a burnt batch the following morning. The apprentices, ever wary of tempting fate, sometimes tap their hats twice, just to be sure. Historians still argue whether this was a universal practice or a local tradition, but in this bakery, no one dares skip it. As the bakers trickle out into the evening, hats under arms or perched jauntily on heads, the chief stays behind to complete the final rounds. He checks the storerooms, leaves a scrap of bread for the temple cat, and finally, with a satisfied sigh, takes his own hat from its shelf. Outside, the city's sounds have softened. The distant call of a market vendor, the lap of the Nile against the banks, the laughter of children weaving through the dusk. The chief catches your eye and gestures for you to join him on the bakery's small terrace overlooking the river. The sky blazes orange and purple, and for a moment, the only sound is the gentle rustle of palm fronds and the faint, rhythmic creak of reed boats drifting by. He tells you stories, some funny, some wistful, about hats lost to sudden gusts of wind, about dough that refused to rise until a hat was worn inside out, about the old master who claimed his hat could predict when the Nile would flood. A good hat, he says, is like a good loaf. It takes patience, care, and a bit of luck. But most of all, it takes people willing to share the work and the laughter. He adjusts his own hat, a fond smile creasing his face. That's what keeps the spirit of the bakery alive, long after the ovens go cold. As darkness settles and the first stars prick the sky, you feel a quiet kinship with this place and its people. The day's work is done, but the bonds woven through laughter, rivalry, stories and hats remain, threaded through every corner of the bakery, sturdy as the linen and reeds from which the hats are made. You step out into the night, your own hat a little askew, heart warmed by the simple, enduring magic of a day spent among Egypt's bakers and their remarkable, ever-rising hats. Night deepens over the ancient city, and the bakery settles into silence, save for the soft scuttle of the temple cat weaving between empty baskets. The heat of the ovens lingers in the bricks, and the scent of baked bread drifts out into the cool air, mingling with the distant perfume of lotus and river reeds. The last hats of the evening, resting on their pegs or nestled in woven baskets, seem to stand guard, a gentle reminder of the day's work and the stories stitched, patched and flower-dusted into every fold. You find yourself reflecting on all you've witnessed. The hats are more than just fabric and flair. They're living artifacts shaped by generations of laughter, rivalry, superstition and pride. In their height and decoration, you see the ambitions and artistry of their wearers. In their stains and patches, you read the record of everyday triumphs and mishaps. Every baker's hat is an autobiography, a badge of office, a family heirloom, and a canvas for dreams. Mainstream history books might describe ancient Egyptian bakers as anonymous laborers, lost in the shadow of pharaohs and priests. But here, in the hush of closing time, it's clear that the bakery is a world unto itself, a place where tall hats mean as much as tall tales, and where daily life is a patchwork of ritual, invention, and friendship. The hats are a language, a currency, and a shield against the monotony of endless dough and heat. A charming, lesser-known fact. In some neighborhoods, the baker's hat became a symbol of hospitality. During festivals, bakers would tie extra ribbons or amulets on their hats and parade through the streets, handing out scraps of sweet bread to children and elders. It was said that anyone who received bread from a baker in full regalia would have good luck for the rest of the year. Some say this custom faded with time. Others insist it lives on in quieter forms whenever a baker shares an extra roll or a secret recipe with a neighbor. Historians still debate whether these processions were ever officially sanctioned or just a heartwarming bit of local color. Even at night, the hats don't fully rest. You hear an apprentice lingering by the door, whispering a quick blessing to his cap before heading home. "Let tomorrow's bread rise better than today's," he murmurs, the words half prayer, half wish. The chief baker, already halfway down the street, turns and calls back, "And may your hat never fall off, not even in a strong Nile breeze." The apprentice grins, tugs his hat tight, and disappears into the night. You stroll the empty bakery one last time, running your fingers along the row of hats on their shelf. Each one feels different, some crisp and new, others soft and worn, holding the echoes of 1,000 mornings. You realize that in this place, the hats are a thread tying past to present, apprentice to master, laughter to labor. They are the shape of community, rising with the dough, bending in the heat, and always, always ready for one more story. As you step out into the moonlit street, the bakery's window glows behind you, a beacon of warmth and memory. The river whispers nearby, and overhead, the stars scatter across the sky like flour on a baker's bench. You tip your borrowed hat to the night, feeling for just a moment that you belong to this ancient fellowship. A world where hats rise high, bread rises higher, and the heart of Egypt beats in every loaf and every laugh.